Welcome everyone to today's special Geekfest discussion with Tony Douglas on climate research, insights and communications. You haven't met me before. My name is Peter Style. I'm the other Peter at Essential and I'm going to be facilitating today. I grew up on Gadigal land and I now live on Dharawal land. Wherever we are across Australia today, we are on Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land. So we're starting by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognising their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and together we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and of course acknowledge any First Nations people with us today. I'm going to introduce Tony properly in a moment, but first we might do a little bit of extra housekeeping because we've got quite a lot of extra new faces with us today. So firstly, we are recording the session. It will be on the internet later, so let us know if that's an issue in the chat. The style of these events are as conversational as possible. We really want you to be involved. We hope them to be relaxed, respectful, inclusive. And so a few things to give you the best possible experience that we recommend are, firstly, we really encourage you to keep your video on. We found it really helps to add to a sense of togetherness that the Zoom platform facilitates. So if you're on a computer or laptop, set your camera to gallery view, which is up in the top right-hand corner. Have a look at everyone's faces, be part of the room. There is a chat function. Use it to ask questions, make comments. We really welcome you to introduce yourself, so people know who's in the room, where you're from. It'd be great if you could use your full name. If you're representing an organisation, you can include that. Everyone will be defaulted to be on mute. So if you are called up during the Q&A to ask your question or to make a comment, you'll have to accept that unmuting before you can be heard. So just be careful to wait a moment to do that before you start talking. If you've got any technical issues at all, we've got a tech support person which will identify themselves in the chat. You can message them privately to work out what the issue is. But let's get on with it. And I'm going to introduce Tony now. Tony Douglas founded Essential 1997, known until more recently as EMC. He's led scores, no doubt you've lost count, Tony, of research projects to inform campaigns and communications, watched and analysed literally hundreds of focus groups over the last 20 years. On climate issues, there's a large portfolio of work that's built up, and today we hope to articulate some of the latest communications and insights and have a really good discussion about it. Over the last year, there's probably a dozen or so projects on climate issues, working with organisations in the environment, government, finance, superannuation sectors, and that's largely the basis of the insights that Tony will be talking about today. It's a bit of a different Geekfest to what many of you, what the regulars will be used to. We're largely talking about qualitative insights, far less tables, way more words, I'm afraid, geeks. But Tony, welcome. And as you know, we usually start with a check-in just to see how people have navigated the coronavirus pandemic. Are you as stir-crazy as I am?
No, but I've got two school-aged children trying to study remotely, and the second term experience wasn't great for them, and we're just a little bit worried about what's going to happen to the education year for our children, really, as a result of the coronavirus and the second lockdown in Victoria.
Yeah, well, everyone's thoughts are with you and fellow Victorians up in New South Wales. We're sort of holding our breath as I imagine other people around the country are hoping that it doesn't come our way. So many of us in the room are familiar with, just before I get your presentation up, Tony, a lot of us in the room will be familiar with qualitative work, but I imagine some of us aren't. So I was going to ask if you just wanted to start by talking a bit about what the differences are in terms of the insights that we can get for our campaign and our communications, and how does a focus group actually work?
Well, I think the qualitative research is different from the polling. The polling tells us what people think and can give you hard numbers about who they are and what they think. But the qualitative research gets you inside to understand underneath why they think, what they know, what they don't know, what information helps actually push people in the direction that your campaign wants them to. So you can test a lot of communications ideas in your qualitative research. And as we mainly do group discussions, it also gives you an insight into how that group of people might discuss these issues amongst themselves. And it means you can target particular groups of people and get a richer understanding of how they might engage with the issue that you're interested in, because people in politics who spend 100% of their lives engaged in issues are often always surprised at how little engagement there actually is amongst groups in the general community around their issues. So finding out what are the engagement points where you actually get people to take notice of your issue and what you're saying are as critical as what people think sometimes in terms of putting a communications plan together.
Great. And I'm going to bring up your presentation now. And while I do that, you've actually just quite recently given a slimmed down version of this, haven't you? Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, myself and Amanda McKenzie, the CEO of the Climate Council, gave a presentation on what people are thinking now about climate change amidst the pandemic and the economic shutdown. And it was only a half-hour session, and we didn't get to cover a lot of the things we wanted to talk about in the half-hour session, and just asked people who were at that session whether they'd like a longer session to get into some of the things we wanted to talk about. And I think we got about 40 people from that session saying yes, they'd like to be part of a longer session. So we thought we'd do a session at an Australia at Home event and see who was actually interested in hearing about this issue and what we know about it, and some of the things actually we don't know about it that we should be exploring.
And can I get some waves from people in the room just to check that you can see that presentation up on your, that's fantastic, great. Tony, take us away, like where are we at now?
So I think what we have seen in the essential research and what we've generally seen in climate research is that the issue, alongside the pandemic, the concern about jobs and economic recovery dominates all other issues to an extent that I haven't seen another issue dominate people's thinking since you go back 10 or 12 years. So that is going to be the core issue. That's going to be the prism through which a lot of other issues are looked at from now on, from what we see in the research. Might say that public attitudes to climate issues really are relatively unchanged over the last year, and they're even unchanged as a result of the pandemic, but they're obviously rated as slightly less important, as a lot of other issues are, in terms of now where we are with jobs and the economic recovery issues. So there hasn't been a shift in attitudes on climate issues, but it just sort of faded from view a bit as this other sort of issue is front and central in a lot of people's lives. And I think you could just say that if you look at the unemployment rate, notionally it's 7%, but when you look at the number of people on JobKeeper who are recording no hours of work, it's about 1.6 million of them. So that means if you add that to the unemployment rate, your actual unemployment rate looks something like 16%, not 7%. So, and we've looked a little further into that, and the underemployment rate, which was always at about 8 or 9%, is also much higher. So you've got up to a third of the community probably either unemployed or underemployed at the moment, and that is why this sits out as the major issue. Next slide, I think, Pete. So these are just general figures, but generally speaking, when you go to the community and ask them questions about climate change, there are about 40% of them that want immediate and meaningful action on it. There's another 40%, many of them pretty lightly engaged in the issue and maybe a little unconvinced by some of the arguments, who want to see some form of action, but basically look at it as a problem that sits 20 years in the future. And there's about 20% who really push back and think that the problem does not exist. So we still get those numbers. Next. However, when you start to talk about renewable energy, we get a much bigger figure. We get 80% of people wanting more renewable energy. And they not only want it to tackle climate change, but there are other people who want it because they think it makes energy cheaper. There are other people who think it's the wave of the future and we need to support new technology, and technological advance is a good thing in itself. And there are some people who also want it because they think it will create economic activity. And there are some people who just more broadly think that would be good for the environment, so why shouldn't we do it? So the gap between the people who want immediate action on climate change but the people who want more renewable energy is about 40%. Next, Pete. And, you know, just again to look at where we are, the numbers shift around a little bit, but they're not shifting around that much. There's a slight fall off in terms of not doing enough, but the core numbers on this issue, even with the pandemic, really haven't moved that much. And again, as you can see, the movements are not that much. And when we go and look at, say, something like the bushfires, which a lot of people had hoped brought home to numbers of people that we need to do something about climate change, and here's human activity causing real problems for people, you got something of a little bit of a drop off. It really didn't make the impact that we thought. And that's because there's numbers of groups in the community, which we'll get onto later, who have been impervious to climate change messages for a whole lot of reasons. Next. So while everybody throws their hands up about, you know, the problems with the federal government not doing much on climate change and not seeing much movement on these issues, underneath that, there's probably a lot of movement happening. You can see that state governments, and you look at the Victorian government, more recently the New South Wales government, and the South Australian government historically and now, are all moving quite quickly to see the adoption of renewable energy and the setting of policies that will actually reduce climate change. And that's happening with Liberal and Labor governments through the states. And of course, the states have a very significant role around energy production and distribution. In fact, you know, it's their responsibility under our federation. So the options for getting action, as numbers of organisations would know, look greater at the state level than perhaps the federal level at the moment. We're also seeing really significant changes in the way in which investors, you know, large pension funds, big investment houses like BlackRock and others internationally, are not only understanding the financial risks of climate, they are now setting policies around what they'll invest in and what they won't, and what their expectations are of company CEOs and boards of directors around their climate change policies. And this is probably more than anything else starting to change business practice and probably moving the needle on climate change. And the issue for investors is primarily around the issue of risk. And it's now been made clear by the regulators in Australia, the Reserve Bank, APRA, ASIC, and the international central banks, that they have now basically said to everybody that climate change is the largest financial risk that the economies face in the short, medium and long term, and that we need to take action to deal with this risk. It's sort of questionable at this stage whether many of the members of those pension and superannuation funds understand the risk of this, but a lot of the funds are acting in terms of being risk managers for their members on this. And as a result, you can see boardrooms shifting. I mean, you can see the shift in the policies of companies like Rio Tinto, Fortescue Metals Group, BHP, AGL, and these policies appear to be significant change, not just greenwash. So there's quite a bit of movement now happening on this issue, and the weight of money, investment money, is starting to move on it.
And that's a global trend, Tony. I wonder, do we have much evidence to be saying that the discussion in the community here in Australia is very different to, you know, other similar jurisdictions overseas?
I think we've got super funds in Australia, particularly the not-for-profit funds, that have high degrees of trust from their membership, and so the funds in Australia can act on this because they have this relationship of trust with their members, and that's one of the significant things about superannuation funds in Australia, that level of trust that members have with them.
I've got a comment in the chat already from Robin, sort of talking about the interlinked nature of some of these issues for some people: climate change, loss of diversity, extinction, other environment issues, and then the pandemic and economic impacts. Do you have any reflections on that? Do you think that that emphasis on the practical is going to change anytime soon with what we're experiencing at the moment?
The emphasis on which, sorry?
Well, we had that table up before. There hasn't been a change in June. Will an extended pandemic start to change the way that people are thinking about these issues over time?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that a couple of things that have changed have been that governments in Australia have put the health of their citizens above the ability of people to make money. And that is a very major change, that people have been put first before money. So there's a social agenda, and a health agenda dominates an economic agenda. And the second thing that's happened in terms of the economic agenda is that governments have intervened in a major way and spent money to support people and to support the economy. But it's in that order: support people and support the economy. If you've seen what Scott Morrison's saying and what he's doing, that's the way it's seen. So you've got a major change in the way the economic or the political environment works. All of a sudden, large-scale government intervention is not something that is stuck in a straitjacket, and putting the interests of people before the economy has actually changed the way people would think about that. I don't know that that's also going to create a set of changes that diminishes or enhances the attitude to climate change, but there is some messaging that could get you in that direction, which we'll come to a bit later.
And there's a couple of people in the chat who asking, exclaiming, striking that there was no significant shift following the bushfires, and we're gonna get to that a bit later too. So, Tony, what is the challenge ahead? What do we need to do next?
Okay, well, let's go to the next slide. And I think one of the things that we have seen through a lot of the research over 10 or 12 years is that there really hasn't been a big engagement with working class people in this country on this issue. And they, to the extent that they don't rate it as a very important issue, like it's not rating in the top 2 or 3 issues for them, it's possibly a second or third tier issue. And some of them are quite suspicious of the idea. So we started just recently to dig round on this issue as to why this is the case, because there's been a lot of communication, a lot of facts, a lot of well-constructed things that have been put out in the community. And I think we've come to a general conclusion here that people with university education are used to dealing with abstract concepts, and they're used to dealing with process-driven and longer-term solutions to problems. People who have not had that level of education tend to be very practical people. They deal with practical and concrete circumstances in their working life, and they tend to deal with specific actions that resolve problems. And for a lot of people, climate change itself is an abstract construct. It's a concept that they don't grapple with straight away. So it means that probably this issue might need to be broken down into a more concrete set of discussions around things like how the energy system is working and things like that, to really start to connect with people in a way that you can get them to support meaningful action, which will lead to reduction in carbon emissions. Whereas the university educated people buy the concept of climate change. They understand it well, and they understand when you start talking about 20-year solutions or 10-year process-driven solutions, because that's their training and that's what they probably do in the workplace. So it took us to be given some specific projects to start to look at this, to understand it. And I guess one of the examples came to us where there was a blue-collar worker who said in a group, "I'm not so sure about whether climate change exists or not, but it could be a risk in the future, and I want my super fund to manage that risk for me." And when we put up notions about funding renewable energy projects, those groups broadly supported that, very much so. When we started to talk more about more abstract concepts around climate change, they went back to debating about whether it was real or what was happening or how long it would happen. So it was really interesting to see some of those more working class groups really deal very positively with the concrete ideas around renewable energy, and find it a lot more difficult to deal with some of the broader ideas around climate change. So I think
there's very, very high levels of support for a whole range of, as you described, immediate and practical measures on energy, not just renewables, right?
Yes, that's right. So I think that's a critical issue for people going forward, and it means breaking the debate down a bit into particular areas where people can grasp concrete ideas.
And we'll move on.
I think the other thing that our research has done over the last 12 months or so has started to look at the opponent's tactics and how it works. And they have gone to some pretty concrete areas, as they always have, about, you act on climate change, it'll cost jobs in the coal industry, or, renewable energy will cost more, or renewable energy hasn't got the capability when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, those kind of things. And these talking points were often repeated back to us in focus groups. But when we asked a few more questions, it was quite clear that people were a little unsure about whether those points were right, and there was no argument beneath them. So they are in fact just talking points, and they're designed to basically block discussion, and they're designed to provide an excuse to block action. They're not actually an argument that's being put up. But it gives us an indication of where we need to go with our arguments to convince people that these actions are required and warranted. But you're not running against people who are getting out there and saying, coal is really good, and it's going to provide cheaper power for us in the long term, and it's going to help deal with carbon emissions, and it's going to create more jobs. Nobody's actually out there running a counter argument that has got any depth to it. They are pretty much talking points that are parroted on talkback radio and put out by governments that don't want to act on it, and by, you know, the fossil fuel industry. There's not a strong set of arguments underneath it, and when you ask people what the arguments are, they couldn't identify it, and they begin to doubt the talking points. So some of the understanding about how to deal with the community more broadly, outside of educated and progressive groups that are very much on board with doing something about climate change, came from having to run some campaigns in the past. And some of these things open the door to understanding how to more broadly connect with people. So when we worked with the former Labor government in South Australia for their energy policy, when they were under severe attack from basically the federal government at the time, and also from coal interests, the arguments that worked broadly with South Australians were these: that there's an inevitability around the replacement of coal and fossil fuels with renewable energy. And the key points to remind people on that were sort of things that had happened that they weren't aware of. So you're filling an information gap. When you said to people, you know, 10 coal plants have already closed in Australia in the last 10 years, and well, you know, another 10 or 15 are going to close in the next 15 or 20 years, and we need to be prepared to make the change. When you put up an argument from the head of the Australian Industry Group, Innes Willocks, that said there is no investor around looking to invest in coal-fired power plants anymore because as the emissions and the economics don't add up, that was a very strong argument for a lot of undecided people about this issue, that was not the path to go. So I think we found that there were information gaps for a lot of people, and we found the technological inevitability driven by evidence that you could provide. This change was already underway, had a big impact on a lot of people who were not necessarily aligned with the idea of going full scale to renewable energy before you put that information in people's hands. And the other thing in South Australia that emerged through that research was it was clear some of the rock solid opposition to the change was actually coming from a group of people, particularly men over the age of 65, and theirs was sort of an economic and cultural opposition to the change, and they viewed coal-fired power plants pretty much in the way they viewed car manufacturing plants, as places where blue-collar people could get secure, well-paid jobs that had status in the community. And they looked at the present and the future, and they didn't see any of those opportunities for blue-collar people anymore. So closing down a coal plant for a lot of those people was pretty similar to closing down a car plant, because it took away that opportunity and status and security for working class people. And that was an first indication for us that there's a gap in talking to working class Australians about this issue. Another thing that interested us was the renewable energy target campaign we were associated with in 2014, where there was a lot of support for increasing the renewable energy target, not reducing it. And a lot of it came from people who had rooftop solar on their houses. And their concern about this issue was not necessarily a climate change concern, as subsequent polling has shown of people who've got rooftop solar. They were very attracted to the idea of renewable energy as reducing prices, because it clearly reduced energy prices for them, energy costs for them. And they also liked the new technology. They'd fallen in love with the technology because it was on their roof. So that was driven by a question around, we like new technology and we like cost reductions. And going back even further, it's not sort of widely known, but in 2007, the miners' union came to us and said, we are very concerned that we're not going to win any of these North Queensland seats in this federal election because Barnaby Joyce and Deanne Kelly are running a scare campaign about climate change and the cost of jobs to our members and other people. Can you go up and have a look at this and see what the issue might be. So we went up there and looked at it, and we found that, in fact, for people in the tourism industry and the agriculture industry and even the coal mining industry, that there was an even bigger scare campaign that could be run against the government for not taking climate change seriously, and that was the threat to jobs in their industries and their communities. And so some ads were run that had people from the mining industry, tourism industry and agriculture industry looking at drought, damage to barrier reef, and the idea that coal might be on the way out. And their comments were, we need a government that takes climate change seriously, and the current government of John Howard is not doing it. Now, they spent about $500,000, I think, on that campaign, and what they finished up doing was playing a very big role in shifting most of those North Queensland seats over to the Labor Party. I mean, there was something like a 15% swing in Leichhardt and a 12.5% swing in Dawson, a 10% swing in Flynn and a 8.5% swing in Hinkler, which were the 4 seats targeted. And Labor won 3 of those 4, and those 3 seats had average swings well above the state average swing in Queensland at that election to the Labor Party. So that gave us an indication that if you talk in terms of jobs, industry and community and focus it in areas where people can directly relate to your message and your story, you're much more likely to actually have an impact with what you're talking about. Peter.
So Tony, so solar panels playing a really key role in shifting community attitudes previously. Do you think is there a new opportunity there, taking it the next step to electric cars and household batteries? Is that going to do the same? Is that going to have the same impact with this framing that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's going to be worth looking at. I think it's going to be worth looking at those sort of economic and technology questions in terms of driving the messages to get different outcomes. Because this is now dating back 12 years, those 3 campaigns, they're all different. They're all on different aspects of these issues, but they all were effective because there was some economic aspect to them that engaged voters.
I'll move on in your presentation, Tony, but I'll just take a moment just to remind people that just to jump into the chat, make any comments, questions. There'll be an opportunity later on, but we'd love to hear from you as we go along. So, how are we actually going to do that, Tony?
Right. Well, I think there's some things that we have seen in recent research that comes down to how you might frame the problem. And given that we're looking at the real economy and jobs being front and central, the argument, we've tested this a couple of times, and we think the argument can be framed in this way, that the Australian economy is not going to snap back to where it was. Australia will have well over 10% unemployment and 20% underemployment. Governments are going to have to continue to invest a lot of money in the next few years to get growth going and reduce unemployment, given that the private sector will be cutting costs and shedding jobs. So we need to make sure that investment is not wasted and it is used to solve longer term problems. We don't want to throw money at the economy and be left with a large debt and leave the bigger problems unsolved. We need to use this opportunity to set ourselves up for the future. So there's a progressive argument and a conservative argument in that one. The progressive argument is that we need to solve the problems for the future and we need to help people now. And the conservative argument is, while we're doing it, we don't want to be wasting money. So if it's sort of framed in that way, then you get to say, you get to define what are the longer term problems that Australia's got where the money has to go. And this is where, you know, Amanda McKenzie, who did the presentation with me 2 weeks ago, was developing some sort of thinking around what an economic agenda like. And another one of our Clients Environment Victoria has also been doing that in the Victorian landscape about, okay, we're going to invest money. Let's invest money and solve the climate change problem. Let's transform our energy system so there's more renewables, there's a modernised grid, there's more renewables, and that creates jobs now, and it actually solves a longer term problem. So I think there's a chance to frame the problem and then in that way and attach our issue to the recovery. I think there's also a number of ideas that we probably need to socialise as key economic ideas. I think we start by putting an evidence base to people about the change that's happening. We need to win the argument about the price of renewable energy dropping below coal. One of the things that can be done in terms of talking to people who parrot the idea that renewable energy is more costly, you can give them permission to change their mind by saying things like, well, 6 or 7 years ago, that was definitely true, but the technology has advanced to the point where now, renewable energy is cheaper than coal. You can also want to extend that argument by saying the threat to our economy in the future actually looks like climate change, and you don't need to take our word for it. And then you can quote the regulators and the central banks. They have the fact that those organisations have made these comments, people don't know about them, but the more you repeat them, the more people are convinced that the change is on the way and the change has to happen, and there's a real threat to the future of the economy if we don't make it. There's also some other things that we have found that we've tested a number of times now that provide information and evidence to people who are otherwise quite low information voters on this stuff. The major mining houses, Rio and BHP, are getting out of coal. Over the last decade, 11 coal-fired power stations have shut in Australia, and in each instance, their generating capacity has been replaced mainly by renewables. In the next 15 years, most of the rest of Australia's coal-fired power stations will be decommissioned. And you can quote some of the CEOs saying that their coal plants are going to be decommissioned. Australia has an ageing, expensive and increasingly unreliable energy system that produces nearly 40% of the carbon emissions. These are core things that people don't know, but they're facts that people are ready to believe, and they really cement your case. And the final argument is, it makes sense to bring forward the investment we need to make in renewable energy anyway to create jobs now, fix our energy system and solve our climate change problem. So they're the kind of facts and arguments that are about the real economy that people don't know, but when you introduce them into an argument, it starts to shift people's view about what's going to happen. I think there are a couple of core economic ideas worth socialising in the current context. I've already talked about the idea of the inevitability of change from coal to renewables and the sense that coal might not be economically viable anymore and is unlikely to attract private investment. I think any of the things we talk about needs to be very concrete in, if we make this investment, it will provide these jobs now. That has to be as concrete for people as possible. I think we need to win the contested argument about the cost of renewables versus fossil fuels. That is a totally contested space. When you poll it, 30% of people think renewables are cheaper, 30% think coals are cheaper, and the rest don't know. And that gives an indication that while climate change campaigners have clearly won the environmental argument, but in a sense have not really contested some of the key economic issues surrounding this, it's led to a bit of a default victory for the fossil fuel interests that we haven't more fully contested this space. And I think, as I've said, the arguments of business leaders who are increasingly making comments about this issue and about this change are actually very valuable in backing up what you're saying, because they're not seen as environmentalists. They're seen as people making, practical decisions based on economic self-interest. Okay.
We've got Miriam Lyons active in the chat, who many of you will know as one of the most experienced campaigners and experts in this space in Australia. Miriam, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm here. I think I'm unmuted. Hi, how's it going? Yeah, so a couple of things came up for me out of that. One is, when you talked about the fact that, we've got 80% support for renewables, that's phenomenal, given that actually the climate movement has not spent nearly as much money promoting renewables as the fossil fuel industry has spent promoting fossil fuels. So the fact that it has that overwhelming level of public support is amazing. The other thing that came up for me is, when you're seeing people parroting those conservative talking points, I think that's often happening in places where the climate movement has not been present. So they're parroting the only things that they hear in a context where other people are not telling the other side of the story. So I guess I'm wondering what your advice would be to the climate movement in its broadest possible sense, to how to make the most of the fact that renewables are so overwhelmingly popular, and to, actually do the hard work of shifting people in marginal seats, so that we don't just see that 80% popular support, we actually see people acting on that in order to make sure that their representatives are actually backing renewables and not fossil fuels.
Well, I know that some of the Sydney talkback radio is pretty hard to penetrate because it's quite ideological, but a lot of the talkback radio around the rest of the country is at least partially open to having a fact-based discussion about these things, and that's where a lot of, the audience I've been talking about, which is the more working class audience and some of the older audience as well, you may want to become more competitive through that channel and produce stories and pitch them into those into that channel and into those producers and talkback hosts, and get some kind of discussion going and just push back against culture war arguments. And I think it's pretty easy to convince people that you say, look, that stuff about price, well, that was right 6 or 7 years ago, what you're saying, but actually it's changed now. It's looking like this is, cheaper. And that's why the marketplace is moving. And I think you could probably make some ground in places where we probably haven't competed very strongly before on these issues. And if you can get involved in talkback, you can probably have a debate. And what will come up is that the other side only have talking points. They don't actually have a long form argument to support what they're saying.
There's a couple of questions about gas. Coal has been a vexed question, and now gas is becoming even more so. Mitzi, are you there? We got Mitzi.
Oh, yes. I've just unmuted. So, look, I was just wondering about natural gas being seen as a transition fuel. I think people in, the fossil fuel industry, particularly coal, are seeing the writing on the wall, and I think they're just trying to be very agile and pivot to natural gas. And putting forward the proposition that gas can be seen as a transition fuel. So, what do we do about that?
I think it's a very good question, and we haven't really got in depth and done any research on gas at all. But I note that it's a key part of Angus Taylor's sort of roadmap forward, and I think it would be a good idea to get some research and develop some draft messaging and that round gas to see how you would manage it. Now, clearly gas has got a bad rap in some parts of Australia through fracking and the work of Lock the Gate. And clearly this is sort of going to be an issue in the Northern Territory, where one of the Conservative opposition parties is running on an anti-fracking platform. So at that level, there's some problems with gas, but at the wider level that you're talking about, I don't think I haven't done the research, maybe somebody else has done it. I haven't done the research and developed the messaging to deal with that question, but I think it's important that it be done. I think it's a good point.
Tony, if that's a gap in the research, looking forward to an extended coronavirus period of a suppression strategy, what are the other gaps that we need to explore for campaigns over the next 12 months?
Well, I think another issue that sits on top of a lot of people's agenda still, and always has been that question of cost of living. For lots of households, that's a struggle, and I guess it's going to become a bigger struggle for people who've lost income or lost their jobs. I'm not certain how you can take that particular issue and make a major issue about the change, but if you prosecute the case that renewable energy is an answer to cheaper fuel, and if you're looking to run a campaign about getting more household rooftop solar about, clearly that would help in that area. And gas might also fall a victim to that campaign, because we have seen the trebling over the years of gas prices as they've risen to that of the international price level. So gas used to be cheap and now it's expensive. So it might well be an argument about gas would go straight to the question of price, that you're paying an awful lot on your gas bills, and that maybe there needs to be refit of houses to refit them away from gas and to renewables, to deal with cost of living issues and to employ people.
Annette has picked up on focus in the discussion around energy. Annette, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, you seem to be talking a lot about energy and the energy mix, gas and such. But what about addressing consumption? Because we're talking about, all the hundreds of thousands and millions of items that we see in the post. It's producing all those things. It's getting it from A to B. So, that's what's driving energy as well, and certainly carbon emissions. So what about consumption and overconsumption?
The issue around consumption, if it's pushed at individual people, you then make it their responsibility that this is a problem. And you don't then necessarily get to an argument about some kind of systemic or structural change.
Yeah.
So that's why I tended to push away from that. The argument might well work around efficiency and use of energy. And we did some work a while ago for people who are concerned about energy efficiency. And clearly at industrial scale, there is significant energy efficiency problems in Australia. But again, that's more structural than consumer. The last thing probably to say about that is we have looked at the issue of electric vehicles and that argument. And while people can sort of see that will make a change, they don't know enough about electric vehicles now. They think electric vehicles are things like Teslas for rich people. They don't understand that most of the major car manufacturers are moving to produce 50% of vehicles as electric vehicles by the end of the decade. And they think electric vehicles cost more than ordinary vehicles and therefore would be out of their price range. There are still a few people who worry about whether in fact battery technology for vehicles means you can travel far enough, but it's mainly around cost and not understanding that major car makers are moving in this direction. So there could be a lot of work done in the space around electric vehicles, which would get down to consumer choice about which car you buy and which car you use, which is going to reduce fossil fuel usage a great deal, and it's also going to deal with other problems around pollution of cities and noise pollution and other things. So there are a lot of attractive arguments in that space, but the ground hasn't been prepared effectively enough for it. If there was a major push around that, you might actually get some changes happening as people understand that electric vehicles are on the way and that there's going to be a very big change occurring over the next 10 or 15 years. It's sort of like electric vehicles are where renewable energy was 10 or 12 years ago.
There's a lot of chat, different questions about Queensland and, you know, what's changed since 2007. We've got questions about the upcoming election. With the coronavirus pandemic, we've got a lot of the tourism jobs that were used in many of our previous campaigns and arguments in that state. Tony, how do we tackle that in October in Queensland?
I really don't know the answer to how you tackle that in such a short space of time, but I guess there's a few things to say about Queensland. The first thing is that the coal industry is a permanent interest in Queensland and it never stops. And it's got a drumbeat of arguments that run and run and run. And there have been periods where campaigns have been run in Queensland that have countered strongly those messages about the coal industry on jobs, and in fact made them very vulnerable. Like the Barrier Reef campaign that ran, that was a factor in Newman losing his seat and losing government, was, yeah, right, well, you talk about the jobs you create, but actually how many of them are there and what's going to happen to tourism jobs. And that did work by tackling them about the question of jobs. But I think there's been some inconsistent. They've been very consistent and they spend a lot of money. We've got less money and we've been a bit inconsistent about dealing with them. The issue of the Queensland election now, I guess there are going to be 3 or 4 inner suburban Brisbane seats that are very green. What we've noted in the past in our research is how green a lot of Brisbane is. And if there is a definite voter choice there, you've got a chance of getting people to vote for the action on climate change and for the green alternative, whether that's a choice between Labor and Liberal or even between Green and Liberal. The other problem that, say, the LNP in particular have in Queensland, which the Queensland Labor Party's fed off for the last 30 years and won election after election on, is finding the issues that split the more educated, progressive, Liberal vote in Brisbane and other places from the National Party sort of vote in the north of the state. And that has played badly for the Liberals in Brisbane, state election after state election in Queensland. I think, you know, when you look at it, there should be some hope here if you've got the right strategy, because the Queensland Labor Party has won 9 of the last 11 state elections. The Federal Labor Party has only once in the last 11 elections won a majority of House of Reps seats in a federal election. There is a vast gap in performance from the same party over the same period of time. Now, certainly there are different leaders and different issues sometimes there, but that ability of the Queensland State Party to wedge those groups of Liberal and National voters has been a central thing in terms of winning a lot of those state elections. And I don't think that has been done at a federal level. And I think there is an opportunity there. And let's not forget that the Greens actually won a Liberal state seat, lower house seat at the last election. And they are competitive in some others. So Brisbane's green.
Just following on from your earlier reflection about Queensland and the fossil fuel industry, Alison Orme has a reflection and a question. Alison, are you still there? Are you?
I am, yeah.
Hey,
Thanks, Tony, and hi, Peter.
Hi, Alison.
Hi. I was just wondering, you talk about, you know, the power of renewables in the electorate's mind. It is all about jobs at the moment. Should we be smashing the fossil fuel industry for its misrepresentations about the number of jobs it creates? Or should we be trying to convince people that renewables provide more jobs? Like, what do you think would be a more successful campaign if we were to choose one?
I think at the moment, Alison, people want hope, they want good ideas. And I would start off with the good ideas and then I would compare and contrast. You can go after them when you say, yes, we're talking about jobs here. This will create this number of jobs. let's face it, most of your mines are going to have driverless vehicles in them in the next 2 years. Let's face it, there's going to be a net loss of jobs in the coal mines in Queensland because this change is taking place. And that just puts a new piece of information in front of people that they didn't know. It tells them that there'll be less jobs, and it reduces their credibility on the issue when you can see that they're out there reducing jobs, not increasing them, is my sense of how you deal with that. But I think you would start with, we can actually create this number of jobs by doing this, this and this, and then segue to what's actually not happening in the coal industry. I will say that there's a lot of older voters in the outer, cheaper suburbs of Brisbane who pretty much buy the coal industry's message, and they tend to be quite marginal seats too. So, and they're people who know people who've been in the coal industry, or they align coal industry largely with the industrial economy that they grew up with. And so they're quite open to coal industry messages, and they're in places that determine elections. So just need to be aware that that older group, and this is a wider thing, no doubt, Alison, you've been dealing with for years working in this space, that there is a big gap often between what younger voters and older voters think about these issues, and being able to communicate with older voters is not the easiest thing. But if you can talk about jobs and skills and development of opportunities for people, you're more likely to have a conversation with them rather than a closed-minded, nut this off sort of view that you can get with them when you talk about climate change specifically.
And that might be, because there's still quite a lot of dismay in the chat, and there certainly was at the time when that data was released around at the end of the last summer, questions about why the bushfires didn't create a measurable shift. Do you want to just, Tony, just maybe just round back and just summarise that again for people, because it's
sure, because you're asking people to go through 2 or 3 logical steps to get to the point. So the logical step you're asking is, 1, climate change is happening. 2, that climate change is drying out, therefore, and it is drying out the continent. And 3, therefore, leading to longer droughts, which is 4, leading to drying out the environment and the forests, which is leading to the fact that we have more fuel to burn and out of control mega bushfires, and therefore climate change is the cause. So you've asked people to go through 3 or 4 steps. The other side are asking you to go through 1 step. There's a lot of fuel in the forest and it caught fire and it burnt the place down. That's, I mean, lots of people can see our 3 or 4 step argument, but even more people can see their 1 step argument, I guess, is why you finished there.
Thanks, Tony. And with just under a minute left, I'll start to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for coming and spending this hour with us. We had a bunch of questions come through at the last minute. I'm sorry we didn't get to those. Back in the chair next fortnight, you'll be pleased to know Peter Lewis will be back talking about the regular essential report. And we've also got an upcoming session next Monday about the impact of the coronavirus epidemic on youth. So check out the Australia at Home website, register for that. And thank you again for all the people who asked questions and who turned up today. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And any follow-up questions, just email us. Thanks, everyone.